I've been trying to tell Roger to go to graduate school, but now I changed my mind. He's been working very hard. Georg Lichtenberg, one of the great, I would say, wit of the 18th century, even though he was a physicist, once said, in all the languages, the word to be is irregular, hence metaphysics. So there's hope for a foreigner like me. The next speaker is part of the family as well, sprang from Robert's vast enterprise, namely John Yao, who carried this amazing tradition of the poet who write criticism, which is very badly needed. And I'm very pleased to have John coming up to the podium.
Yeah, I decided to pretend I was from Berkeley. So I got a Moe's t-shirt. I don't know if people here know it, but there's a man in Moe's named Owen Hill who writes wonderful detective novels, in which he said this funny anecdote, which I'll pass on. His character meets this woman, and they decide to go to a poetry reading, and he says to her, "Have you ever been to a poetry reading before?" She says, "Oh yes, I went to a reading of Robert Pinsky's." And the main character said, "That's not a poetry reading." It's an advertisement for the novels of Owen Hill. A map, can you hear me? A map that never stays the same. Sun Tzu's 6th century treatise on writing, The Art of War, is one of the many predecessors to Gertrude Stein's How to Write. Written in different epochs, under different dark clouds, war either there or just around the fork in the road, these manifestos are invaluable to an understanding of writing and the written, but in dissimilar ways. One change is that centuries before stories were devalued, by some accounts now costing less than a dime a dozen, Sun Tzu believed in narrative with its beginning, middle, and end. It was an arc, but not a rainbow. For Sun Tzu, the careful construction of a narrative arc, or arch through which the reader-writer passes, was necessary to achieve a resolution to the text wherever and whenever it was written. Obeying one or more of his rules, all set out in The Art of War, one thing was to logically follow another, as well as fit together. It seems not evident to the reader-writer sitting in the distance, watching. Otherwise, London Bridge would collapse, as the children's song insists. Robert Kelly breaks Rule 36 under the section Sun Tzu titled Maneuvering. When you surround an army, leave an outlet free. Do not press a desperate foe too hard. It is a rule that realist writers of every stripe have memorized, whether they know it or not. They do not want to write a sentence that stands by itself with no outlet, isolated from home, and with no place to go to next. The realist gets on the Uptown IRT at the bottom of Manhattan, and minutes or years later he gets off. It can be 42nd Street or El Dorado, but not a place made only of words that is as real as any word is. I live in an old house that has no address, Robert Kelly tells us at the outset of A Line of Sight. The reader is likely to wonder, what can possibly come next? How will the writer get himself out of this cul-de-sac? This is the question I asked when I first read A Line of Sight. The copy of it in my possession is from the second printing, May 1974. I know I read it when it first came out, some time earlier, and then I bought both thin stapled copies at the Grolier Bookshop, 6 Plimpton Street, Cambridge, Mass., which opened in 1927 and is the oldest continuous poetry bookshop in the United States. I learned of it when I was in high school, and the one person near my age that I met there was Amiel Alkali. Gordon Kearney, who was born in Canada in 1893, opened the Grolier. A friend of Conrad Aiken, who had lived upstairs at 6 Plimpton, Kearney was around 70 when I met him. He'd gone to Harvard to study landscape architecture and ended up opening a bookstore that, as the sign on the front door announced, only poetry, no textbooks. Landscape architecture and poetry rhyme, as Alexander Pope knew when he took a secret passageway that contained a grotto to get to his hidden garden. We live in time. A line of sight is different from when I first read it more than 35 years ago, and needless to say, so am I. This is my first attempt to map a small territory of Kelly's that I've explored many times over the years, but until now I've written almost nothing down about my travels there. At the end of the sentence is the sign for a footnote directing the reader to note 1. It begins, a road but no street, a street but no number. According to the author, he's computed that by the grid of the city down the river, he's speaking of New York City, specifically Manhattan, he lives on 2097th Street, West 2097th Street. But as he goes on to say, that city is no longer anybody's system. The grid is more spacious now, builds up as well as out, comprises the nearer stars, has its roots in water. The nearer stars, not the nearest stars. The former suggests a vastness that knows no end, while the latter points to a limit. The house is dark most days, Kelly tells us in the second sentence of chapter 1. The fact that it has no address doesn't bother him, because it doesn't actually reveal where he is. Even the city down the river, its gathering of money, power, and institutions, such as the Museum of Modern Art, is no longer anybody's system. According to Kelly, who seems not to have left the house yet, years ago it had a name, taken from the 2 lime trees that blocked the afternoon sun from the front windows, trees much sought by bees in May and June. I finished the 3rd sentence of chapter 1 before turning to note 2, a name. Irwin Smith, the postmaster, lived in the house around the turn of the century and called the place Lindenwood. From the 2 in front, 1 at the side, saplings all around. He then tells us the tree is Schubert's Lindenbaum, an aching song of nostalgia that summoned Hans Castor back into the bourgeois world from the bourgeois dream world of Davos. I don't know much about Irwin Smith, but pieces of hardware from the original house turn up in other houses round about, a characteristic door hinge, a hasp. The dream world of Davos is in Switzerland. It was where in the 19th century those with lung ailments went. Robert Louis Stevenson and Arthur Conan Doyle spent time there. It's the setting for Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain. Ernst Ludwig Kirchner painted some of his last and best paintings there before committing suicide on June 15, 1938, 5 years after his works were condemned by the Nazis as degenerate. Is there an occult power emanating from this house in which a postmaster and a poet, individuals who puzzle over words and are concerned with messages, origins, and destinations, have chosen to live? Kelly makes no mention of this because it is already there for us to read. Some rhymes do not need to end in a rhyme. A line of sight is 5 short chapters, none more than a page. At 4 paragraphs, the first chapter is the longest. There are 12 notes divided among 4 of the 5 chapters. There are no notes to the last chapter. The longest note is the 5th to chapter 1. It consists of 4 paragraphs. One reads back and forth, stopping at the end of a sentence to turn to a note before finding the way back to where one was. You both return and do not return to where you were. Heraclitus is precise about this. Along the way, the mind drifts. On June 5th, 1967, Kelly wrote the poem Prefix, which begins, "Finding the measure is finding the mantra." I turned 17 on June 5th, 1967, and would graduate from high school before the month was over. My advisor told me to join the Army because I needed to learn more discipline. I chose poetry instead. History, Michel de Certeau tells us, begins at ground level with footsteps. They are the number, but a number that does not form a series. They cannot be counted because each unit is qualitative in nature, a style of tactile apprehension and kinesic appropriation. They are replete with innumerable anomalies. De Certeau goes on to say, the act of walking is to the urban system what the act of speaking, the speech act, is to language or to spoken utterance. On the most elementary level, it has in effect a threefold uttering function. It is the process of appropriation of the topographic system by the pedestrian, just as the speaker appropriates and assumes language. It is a spatial realization of the sight, just as the act of speaking is a sonic realization of language. Lastly, it implies relationships among distinct positions, i.e., pragmatic contracts in the form of movements, just as the verbal utterance's allocution places the others before the speaker and sets up contracts between fellow speakers. A first definition of walking thus seems to be a space of uttering. Or, to see it from another angle, a first definition of uttering thus seems to be a space of walking, of moving from one place to another without necessarily moving in an old house with no address, where, especially at the foot of the stairs, it is dark, bottom of a dry well. On the wall above, the last few treads is a large map of the kingdom of Bhutan, Drak Yul, showing in monochrome relief the ranges and valleys and way stations. In the uncertain light that at times falls on this map, that at times fall on this map from the opposite room, the tan spread of Drak Yul, isolated from the uncolored surround, India, China, Tibet, sometimes resembles a large cookie, at other times a fallen leaf, which before withering rumpled into the crests and gorges. Appropriations, realizations, contracts. Everything Kelly observes is qualified, revealing that whatever place we consciously or unconsciously inhabit, call it a house or reality, is in a state of flux. The light that falls on the map is uncertain. Drak Yul sometimes resembles a large cookie. And against this uncertainty, Kelly juxtaposes another uncertainty. In one corner of the map, there's a small replica in outline of the map itself. This diagram is called the Reliance Index and shows sector by sector the confidence expressed in percentages that the viewer can feel in the information sketched or verbalized in the large map. It is to be wished that every map conceded in such a way the inevitable inadvertency of its parts. A line of sight is a provisional map of a hallway and staircase in Robert Kelly's house with no address. If there are other hallways and other staircases in the house, we do not learn of them right away. They are for the moment the uncolored surround. We are at the bottom of a dry well. Often it is stifling at the head of the stairs, the long hall to the bedroom lined with books and maps. By the doorless doorway, the heat is gentler, the bed is cool. Ralph Waldo Emerson observed, "I am not solitary whilst I read and write, though nobody is with me." At the end of the first chapter, we know, if we read the 5 notes to chapter 1, that Erwin Smith, Franz Schubert, Hans Castorp, John Navins, Helen's great-aunt Malka, Diane Witkowski, Beethoven, Lamont de Young, Dieter Roth, Richard Strauss, Rossini, and Pradyumna P. Karan, the cartographer of the Drak Yul map, are in the house with Kelly. Within the framework of uttering, the walker in relation to his position creates a near and a far, a here and there, dies or two. There is no there, Stein. Within the framework of walking, the speaker, in relation to his position, creates a here and there, Yao, after dies or two. In the hall there, the map of Bhutan is large, and under it the map of Yucatan is small but colorful, with tiny pictures of temples and deities marking the sites. In that specific sense, the god was flayed in the hallway in the half-light, or in the evening ugly yellow glare of the 3 overhead bulbs. Uxmal was built. Kelly. Uxmal means built 3 times in the Mayan language. It is the site, although some, Uxmal means built 3 times in the Mayan language, although some scholars dispute this derivation. At the end of chapter 2, note 1, Yucatan. The neighborhood has a number of spiritual links with Yucatan, and at least one unpublicized telluric nadi or geoastral vein unites the 2 terrains. If for the moment you have lost where you are and are not sure where you're going, you might remember that you're looking into the dark hallway of a house on West 2097th Street, which is, as Kelly tells us at the end of note 1, Yucatan, a northernmost outpost of the Mayan Empire, a ruin like the rest, surrounded by dense thickets and a quiet swamp with very black water. The Mayan Empire and Manhattan share this address. Arthur Macon would be the one taxi driver who would be able to get us there without the help of a GPS. Kelly is waiting to see what other guests will arrive as the nearer stars begin to take their place in the sky. Chapter 3's first sentence. The point is that these objects are not alone in the hall by any means, but are the ones that can be seen wholly or in part from the yellow armchair that stands at the end of the music room, close to the one window the sun reaches, but divided from the window and sun by a small square table covered with cactuses, some living, some questionable, some dead. In the note for yellow armchair, I read, "The armchair is by the window. For my present purposes, if these discursions may be so dignified, this chair is important. For one thing, it is the one armchair in the house in which I'm comfortable. From where I'm sitting, in a brushed aluminum chair, I see a man who's in his late 30s sitting in a yellow armchair. He's looking at exactly what is in front of him. To the left of the map, and somewhere above it, there's a fierce, grinning, bright, polychrome demon mask of unspecified origin, clearly enough the product of some tantric intelligence of the mountains. After talking with this dispatcher, Prince Zaleski, Machin assures me that we will be there shortly. In his book, The Practice of Everyday Life, Deser appropriates 2 military terms, strategies and tactics, to distinguish between those who are in power high above the city and those who walk its streets. He defines strategies as repeatable methods, actions or speech acts based on an overall narrative or totalizing viewpoint, such as painting is dead. Tactics, on the other hand, are the anarchic individual's use of any mode of action that is likely to gain an advantage or success. The walker in the city goes his, her own way, ignoring the directions offered by the city's grid, stopping to look in the windows of the stores closed up for the night. A few blocks from where I live is a hair salon that is open, the sign states, 24/7. At night, walking the dog, I always see a woman sitting in a chair, getting her hair done, back to me or to the window, preferring for the moment to face the mirror. I assume it is both reasonable and practical for her to make an appointment for this hour. Across the street, a large silver truck covered with pictures of steaming plates of rice and meat sells styrofoam containers of food to the taxi drivers that have emigrated from Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. My dog lifts his head. Sun Tzu would have taken a different road to Bhutan. When we pass between these two landmarks, the dog and I are a few blocks away from the Empire State Building, which is built on the land where a 3-story manse owned by the Havemeyers once stood. Henry Osborne Havemeyer founded the American Sugar Refining Company in 1891. Louisine Elder, his second wife and niece of his first, was a friend of Mary Cassatt. Henry and Louise gave the Metropolitan Museum of Art many of its impressionist paintings, including works by Monet, Degas, and Monet. According to the museum's inventory records, nearly 2,000 works in the museum's collection were once in the house on Fifth Avenue. Believers identify the mask as the face of an adept holding back his semen, swallowing the world. The face is the brightest object in the hall at the foot of the stairs. This is the last sentence of chapter 1. Whatever the address, every house, old or new, small or big, becomes a museum, or what Robert Smithson called a sarcophagus, which comes from the Greek and means flesh eater, because the limestone they were originally made from was thought to decompose the flesh. Because of man's sins, he perceives the sphere as a circle. Reflected from its convexity, the items of the wall and hall arrange themselves, maps and beasts and masts, thermostat and architecture. The lintel says this is where the wall ends, or the door begins, or the door ends, and no man can pass by. Because of his sins, in the sphere of sight, every object becomes a surface becomes a word. The word, because of his sins, wandered down the centuries between what we laughably call its root and what we half ashamed, half hopeful call its obsolescence. The word wanders, meaning only one thing to him at a time, because of his sins. Sin, says Clement, is inadvertency. This is the first paragraph of chapter 4. The second paragraph is less than half this length. Let me pause for a moment before continuing. Reading a line of sight is to accompany the author on a walk whose only destination is under the sign, "Keep your eyes open and pay attention." He seems to stay on the same street, but it keeps changing and diverging. Maybe the path is an illusion. Tufu. I set out to find you, and I set out. One day the author walks to the old Barrytown post office by the unused depot on the river and finds in the postcard rack a view of this very house, E. Smith's Lindenwood. He buys it for a penny. Between its root and its obsolescence, the author wanders, meaning only one thing to him at a time. Gertrude Stein sums up the difference between Kelly and herself in the following sentence. I like to compress things. I like a view, but I like to sit with my back turned to it. Not all views, as Stein uses the word, are picturesque. In this instance, she is conventional in the way she thumbs her nose at being conventional. She's left the path where the word means only one thing at a time. A line of sight keeps opening new doors, keeps drifting and sprouting in unanticipated directions. On the way to Annandale, Arthur Machen introduces the idea of the Holy Grail's continuing existence in the popular literature. Peter Straub and Stephen King pick up the possibility and make it their own. Robert Kelly is sitting in his yellow armchair, wondering for a brief moment why his guests are taking so long. Is reading about Edmund Burke from the 11th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, printed in 1911. It is the last hour of your life. Turn down the thermostat. Beyond Bhutan, exactly where you can't see it, is the cabinet of alchemic texts, the red telephone you can't use, the painful manuscript, the air conditioner plugged into the circuit too low in amperage to power it, the chemical lamp, all unseen things. The brave soldier has come at last to the bottom of the well and finds himself in another house, just like all houses, every house. The wall might be the surface of what the Greeks in Neurosphere ingratiatingly called the hospitable, the Euxine Sea, a smiling, most dangerous flatterer. We call it black, and have forgotten to be afraid. The wall wants me to forget everything beyond its so casual opacity. Thanks.